Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're looking at a very difficult and emotive passage from Mark's Gospel in which Jesus is questioned on his views about divorce. Before we dive into that though, if you haven't done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You can find the link for that just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of the reading that we're going to be looking at, some other passages you may find it helpful to look up, the questions we'll be considering later on, and lots of space for you to record your own thoughts, reactions, and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which is from Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, verses 1 to 16. Jesus has just left Capernaum, and indeed the whole region of Galilee, and returned to Judea, to the area we're told beyond the River Jordan, with his disciples. And crowds had gathered around Jesus once again, so as we're told was his custom, he began teaching them. And the use of the word again here suggests that this is part of an ongoing pattern, even as Mark only shows Jesus visiting Jerusalem and its vicinity once before his death on the cross. We know from John's Gospel, however, that Jesus, as every faithful Jewish man did, frequently travelled up to Jerusalem for at least the 3 major pilgrim festivals each year. So I suggest that that's how Jesus came to already be known in that area. We've got quite a few different figures making an appearance in this passage. So we've got Jesus, as I say, continuing his normal rabbinic practice of teaching the crowds who came to him and debating with others within the lively mixed Judaism of the day. We know that Jesus has his disciples with him that included but were not limited to the 12. And they also, it seems, resumed their usual custom of asking Jesus for an explanation of his teachings in private. We learnt all the way back when we looked at chapter 4, verse 34, that Jesus always offered a private explanation of his parables to the disciples, and it seems the same is true here. We've got crowds of people who we're told were flocking to Jesus, looking to hear him teach, and later on to bring small children to him to be touched by him, presumably with the view that the laying on of hands would heal them of some sort of ailment. We've seen that at various other points in Mark's Gospel where Jesus heals by laying on hands. And finally, we've got the Pharisees. The Pharisees belonged to one of the major parties within the lively Judaism of the day, and they were particularly radical in some of their views, and they were particularly keen on the application of the law of Moses in daily life and understanding that in detail. And they were challenging Jesus, as we learn here, about his attitude to divorce, something that was a very contentious issue at that time. Now, Mark's Gospel was the first of the 4 to be written, around sort of the 65 to 70 mark of the Common Era. And it's interesting that Jesus' words in chapter 10, verse 12, that relate to a woman wishing to access divorce against her husband, is removed when Matthew picks up this stuff later on in Matthew 19. And it shows the scandalousness of this countercultural suggestion that Jesus makes in a Jewish setting where only the man could initiate divorce proceedings. So it's just an interesting little take on how Matthew struggles with some of what Mark includes Jesus as saying. What we're looking at here is conflict, firstly between Jesus and the Pharisees, and later between Jesus and his own disciples. And in the midst of making sense of all of that, there are some particular texts that it's helpful to keep in mind as well as our main reading for today. So the primary one here comes from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 to 4. And this is the text that the Pharisees refer to in verse 4 of today's reading to talk about divorce. But it's a text that primarily concerned women not remarrying their first husband if he'd given her a certificate of divorce and she'd later gone on to marry another man. So it's interesting that the context is more complicated of that little Old Testament snippet than we might first think. It's also illustrative to look at Matthew 19 and specifically verses 3 to 9, which kind of gets more of the heart to the matter, really, in the question that the Pharisees put to Jesus, which is what actually constituted appropriate grounds for divorce. And as we'll see, that's at the heart of Jesus' response. And finally, it's also useful to look at a couple of early verses from Genesis 1, verses 27 to 28, and from chapter 2, verse 24. These verses are quoted by Jesus in his response to the Pharisees in verses 6 to 8 of today's reading. So, we've set some of the background up. Now let's have a bit of a delve into the passage. Jesus, as we've seen in verse 1, has travelled to Judea and has been teaching the crowds. And as verse 2 shows us, as part of that, the Pharisees have come to him and they've asked this question about whether it was permitted under Jewish law for a man to divorce his wife. Now, as I say, Matthew 19, and specifically verse 3 of that, kind of cuts to the key issue of what grounds for divorce are appropriate. In Deuteronomy 24, it speaks of the husband issuing a divorce certificate because he's found, and I quote, something objectionable about his wife. But how that was going to be interpreted was a contentious matter. And I think it's why verse 2 tells us the Pharisees were looking to test Jesus by asking him this question, because it was taking him onto contentious ground. And as we recall in chapter 3, verses 31 to 35, Jesus' relationship with his own blood family was not straightforward. So maybe this is an area where the Pharisees thought, we can catch him out, we can pin him into a corner here. Jesus responds to the Pharisees in sort of typical rabbinic fashion by taking their question and responding with another question, as we see in verse 3. When he says, well, what had Moses commanded you? And note the phrasing away from this question about a hypothetical couple through to basically saying, what's on your hearts, kind of moves the goalposts, if you will. Jesus is reframing the question and essentially getting at, what's your attitude then, people who are asking me this question, to divorce? Now, it's important to remember that the Jewish people did not exist in their own kind of vacuum where they had no contact with those who were different to them, and with that, particularly with that Greco-Roman culture surrounding them. And there were differences between Jewish culture and Greco-Roman culture when it came to divorce, and also within Judaism itself. So a few things that it's helpful to note here. Unlike in Roman culture, in Judaism, it was only the man who could initiate divorce proceedings. It was either partner in Roman culture. And so in verse 12, when Jesus addresses this, partly he is talking about that wider culture, but he's also giving women a greater degree of agency than they had within typical Jewish settings at that time. We think of marriage today, on the whole, in 21st century Britain, as being primarily about love. But in that particular culture, it was far more to do with property and status and honour between the two families that were being brought together. So it was more of a transactional thing, one might argue, a lot of the time, which is not to say there were never love matches, but it was primarily about other things. And we see that as a pattern that was repeated in cases where there was a lot of money and property and status at stake in other times and places, not least in our own nation. If you look at something like Pride and Prejudice, for example, Jane Austen's 18th century novel, when it talks about good matches and so on, that's kind of what it's got in mind. And all of that means that divorce in this situation could get very messy, very complicated indeed. Quite often, Jewish people regarded Romans as having looser, less rigorous views about marriage and fidelity and what should happen in divorce. And it's interesting that the only case of a divorce that we have any mention of in Mark's Gospel comes in chapter 6, verses 14 to 29, when it concerns Philip and Herodias. We know that Herod married Herodias even though Philip was his brother, and that John the Baptist was executed effectively because he challenged Herod about the morality of this. There were different, as I said, perspectives within Judaism, and we can kind of frame them in terms of two major rabbinical schools. Rabbi Hillel put forward the liberal and inverted commas perspective that argued that the grounds for divorce, for finding something objectionable about a wife, could be very wide-ranging indeed, including things as trivial as burning the dinner. Whereas at the other end of things, Rabbi Shammai saw adultery as the only appropriate reason for getting a divorce. The Pharisees, in response to Jesus, we see in verse 4, quoted what was allowed in Jewish law. Some translations flesh it out a bit more than the actual Greek does. They omit to mention the issue of a divorce certificate mandated by Deuteronomy 24. And this certificate was important because it offered some protection for women in a culture where if you were thought to have had children outside of marriage, that could potentially lead to you being killed. And what I think Jesus is doing here, as we see in verse 5, when he calls the Pharisees hard-hearted, is seeking to prioritise the vulnerable, prioritise women in a culture where, sadly, women were often treated as property that could be discarded. And indeed, there was very much a sense that the woman was property handed from the father to the husband. And so there was a real separation of women's sexuality from individual autonomy a lot of the time. All of that informs why Jesus says, when the Pharisees just quote selectively from Deuteronomy 24, that they're being hard-hearted. And when he cites the creation narratives of Genesis 1 and 2, what Jesus is doing is taking this issue and framing it in terms of God's desire for integrity in relationships throughout the whole of creation. And as we know, he basically says, let nothing that God has joined together be ripped apart by humankind. In verses 10 through to 12, the disciples, as was their pattern previously, we talked about, asked Jesus for a private explanation. What did he mean by this? And he tells the disciples that the partner of either gender who commits adultery is the one who causes harm to the faithful partner. So there's a sense, I think, that Jesus is not condemning somebody who has walked away from a partner who has committed adultery. And we might want to add today, in our context where there's much greater recognition of abuse within marriage and the damage that that causes to people, one might want to add abuse to that. Now, the action shifts a bit in verses 13 to 16, in that we're back in a wider context, it seems. And it recalls Jesus' clear example that we heard about last week in chapter 9, verses 30 to 37, of welcoming small children. But we see again in verse 13 that the disciples seek to keep children away from Jesus, keep them at arm's length. His response in verse 14 was indignant, and he tells them that the kingdom belongs to children such as that, children who, like women in many situations, were very vulnerable and had no real status in society until they reached an age where they were useful. Now we can translate the Greek of verse 15 in different ways. We can render it welcoming the kingdom of God like a child welcomes it. But it fits better in the context that we're thinking about here to translate it as welcoming the kingdom like you would welcome one of these children. It's a much better fit for the narrative. And once again, in verse 16, we see Jesus embracing the children brought to him as he embraced the child in chapter 9 as well. This is, as we've seen, an undoubtedly difficult reading. And even just glancing through it will have brought up a lot of emotions for many people, as divorce has one way or another touched most of our lives at some point. I would argue very strongly that what Jesus is doing here is not condemning people to be trapped in loveless or even abusive marriages forever and a day. I would suggest that what he's doing is trying to protect women in a culture where, as I say, they were so often regarded as discardable property. And if you could be placed in a really socially and economically and legally perilous position at the whim of your husband for doing something as trivial as burning the dinner, then you did need someone to challenge that framework and that thinking. So I think also the second pericope, Jesus' care for small children who are also vulnerable, highlights that that's what he wants to do. And we need to remember as we read this text, as I've tried to illustrate, that there was quite a difference between attitudes to marriage and divorce in the Judaism of that time and the culture that we now inhabit, with, as I say, greater recognition of things like the reality of abuse within marriage. So it's not a text, I would suggest, that we can just kind of rip out of its original context and transplant into today's. I would further argue that when people have tried to make this a text of terror by saying, well, it clearly shows that marriage is only between a man and a woman and therefore same-sex marriage is impossible, or it says that God created people male and female, so from birth God has put us in one box or the other, and trans people whose experiences don't fit with that are going against God's will. I think all of that is deeply problematic. It's as much of an issue when we turn this text into a text of terror for LGBT plus people as when it is when it has been used as a text of terror against divorced people. And the biggest thing that I want to impress about this reading is the need for compassion in how we respond to people who find themselves vulnerable and marginalised, whoever they are. So as you grapple with today's questions, I hope that will inform where you come to them from.